few years ago, and I mean few by like maybe 10, I met this young man who became a dear, dear friend to me, Justin Thor Simonson. And he was a photographer. And at the time we were partnering on a Black History Month project that he was doing at an art gallery. You know, go figure, 10 years before this version of Black Lives Matters. As an anchor man, he was saying, hey, I want to use this wall space that I have to put up Black faces, Black voices, and Black stories. And so, you know, that made me really like the guy. And a few years after that, as he was exploring his photography career, he decided to start creating table books for his work that were all photos. And he approached me kind of out of the blue with a email that was like 50 or 60 images that he had taken. And he was like, you know, I'm putting together this coffee table book. I've been doing it. I'm experimenting with lots of different platforms. And I feel like it needs something else, you know. And at the time he was like thinking poetry, because that's what I was people were mostly familiar with me as a poet. And I'll preface that by saying I actually had tried in 2012, about the time I became the inaugural poet laureate, to submit to an alibi flash fiction contest and got nowhere, like not even a reply. So it was terrible. I was pretty bad flash fiction writer in my first couple goes, and I'm not pretending I'm good now. But when he gave me the images, you know, I started out trying to force a poem on them. And I was just like, that's not what these images are calling for. And so I challenged myself to do something I wasn't good at, which I encourage all artists to always do, to create new muscles, work different muscle groups than the ones you normally work, muscle confusion, even if you want to call it that, because then when you come back to, you know, the thing that you like to do, the thing that you think that you're good at, you come back with a new approach and new tools in your toolbox for making that better. And I kind of got lost in these images, and of the 50, you know, or 60 he sent me, 24 spoke to me, and literally spoke to me. Like stories came out, like voices started happening in my head, and stories started coming from these images, which I'll share some with you, and we'll look at some of those together, because there's something I want you to be looking for. There's actually the thing that made them start speaking, which I'm going to kind of leave as a mystery for now. And 24 flash fiction pieces later, we bound it, and we had a couple of iterations of it before it got to its current version with the right page setting and typesetting and different things like that. And we started sharing it. And in fact, Dustin works through a program called Blurb, and I will put in air quotes, self-published it, but we actually crowdsourced the publishing and had about 10, we called them founding publishers, who contributed $100 a piece, excuse me, in order to raise the funds in order to get the first run of the books published. We're now on our third run, and it's enjoyed a gallery exhibition at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning, because in that program, one of the big things that they teach is about how structures in architecture create place and place making. And a lot of times we as storytellers also know that, you know, place making is also the stories that you tell about a place, right? That culture is place making. So it's an interesting way that they approach it in UNM School of Architecture and Planning, a program I'm a huge fan of. And they said, yeah, that work fits here. And so we were able to actually have it galleried during the National Placemaking Conference that they were hosting, which they were also gallerying for as well. So we were there with the scientists and the architects, kind of looking at it from a more artistic lens. So that's just the story of the book. I figured I should share that because like when you were all sharing your successes and that creative nonfiction work that took 10 years to be birthed, that's just how these things go sometimes, and they're ready when they're ready. And so that was this kind of story of this book last year. So got a question, and I know like the way Elizabeth set it up, now it's a rhetorical question because you won't be answering. But you know, my question is, what's the definition of flash fiction? You all were just talking about a competition that says 500 words or less. Some people say 300, some people say 150. You know, really just depends on what contest you're going after, and they kind of set the standard. But this was the dictionary definition that I found of flash fiction. And you know, what is truth nowadays? What are dictionaries? I mean, if irregardless is a word, I don't know how much you can count on dictionaries anymore, but this is their definition, right? This is their definition of of what flash fiction is. And I subscribe to a different definition, a very literal definition, right? Poetry derived from flash photography. And I tend to call my flash fiction poetry because I write it in a very poetic fashion. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. I have a few, unbeknownst to me, a few reasons for doing that. I found out later, but partially just because that's what my most comfortable modality. And so I just, they're essentially, sometimes those lines are lines of poetry that are just squished together margin to margin to look like prose, but oftentimes they're not. And as I look back on this piece of work years later after its initial creation and kind of look at what I was trying to do in making the stories look and feel different, that I had to get a little bit away from my kind of default or de facto mode. So here's one. And I'm not going to read it to you. I don't want to make this a poetry reading, but you can see it on your screen, and I'll try to talk less so you can get through it because, they're short. That number you see in the bottom right corner is the word count. And so I wanted to share the varying word counts that I've used in these 24 stories. The largest story was 207 words and the shortest story was 65 words. And I have both of those stories in this presentation today for you to be able to see. Trees are the original carport, he says to her, but nowadays it is a landing strip of bird shit. So I'll take my chances with the sun. Can't be any worse for the paint job. She nods, not necessarily in agreement. Her future landlord does not yet know this walkthrough is his audition. She has an appointment to check out an apartment 2 hours from now. She didn't come to the grocery store hungry. She has options, but she likes the layout more than the landlord. She would actually use her garage as a garage and park her bikes there. She didn't have the heart to tell him. He didn't have the heart to care. To him, she is just rent. To her, he is barely tolerable. Good thing he cares more about his car than his apartment. So I'm gonna share a different part of my screen and some things that I learned about, theory, right? There's an art to this thing of flash fiction, and some guidelines that were shared by David Gaffney, whose work I was not familiar with until I was preparing for this presentation. I'm not going to pretend I followed him, but he's a very accomplished flash fiction writer out of Britain. Wrote this particular article. If you want to know more about the article, it's called Stories in Your Pocket, how to write, I can't see it there anymore, but how to write short stories, I think. And The Guardian, it's in The Guardian in 2012. So it's a pretty old article, but I liked how succinct he kind of put his tip list together and in ways of trying to figure out a unique approach, right, to flash fiction and very short stories. And some of these things I feel like I was doing intuitively. Like I said, I did not know, did not have a framework for how I approached this originally. I was really just letting the visuals speak to me in a true ekphrastic method. But I was kind of tuned in just as a story listener and a storyteller my whole life, trying to say like, hey, you don't have a lot of time to build scene and setting and characters, right? And he talks a little bit, if you read the article, there's more context to each of these points, but he talks a little bit about how, some like names aren't important. Like, sometimes, as he says in number 6, you're writing long and then you're trying to remove stuff. But the other way to approach it is to approach it knowing it's going to be short and coming from a space of how do you jump right into the action, right? Or even jump right into the resolution, because he says a little later, the ending doesn't need to always be at the end. That's where it's a little bit different than a novel and much more like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where maybe the end's the beginning, right? And so play with that timeline in ways that you may not normally do when you're writing longer pieces of fiction or nonfiction for that matter. When he says don't use too many characters, he's not talking about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. He's talking about like these kind of intimate scenes, because you don't have a lot of real estate to manage the different relationships that are happening in a flash fiction piece. And so you want to kind of be essential. And a lot of mine, as you'll see throughout this book, it's just one person. Sometimes it's just like that chatter that's going on in their head, when we talk to ourselves. Sometimes it is an outside narrator talking about the person who is the character, if you will, or the situation that is the character. But really being economical with all the work, right? All the work that I have to do inside those 200 or 300 words, and going deep, right? It's definitely more quality than quantity, trying to make it dense in many ways, right? Make sure the ending isn't at the end. I don't know if that's tried and true. This is David's opinion, and that's something for discussion for the group. I did a little bit of both. You'll see in some of these stories, sometimes my end was just the end. It was a poem, and essentially that last line is supposed to leave you wanting, right? One of my mentors, late mentors, who I'm sure you all know, Tony E. A. Mares, used to say, the sensation of a poem should be like the sensation of a car stopping and your inertia taking you through a windshield, right? Like you don't want it to end, and when it ends, it stays with you. It's still doing that work. It's still pulling you, right? And so that so sometimes I just go for that because I'm a poet. But I thought it was interesting how he was like, he's basically saying don't make the ending predictable. Okay. But in number 5, he's saying make your last line ring like a bell. I don't know if I did that in the first piece that you guys just read, but in some of the other pieces, yeah, the idea is to leave that resonant, that bell, right? Like that continuing sound that's echoing out, like ripples in a lake when you throw a rock in. Mine don't have titles, so do what you want with number 4. Poets are known for leaving things untitled, but I think you can get a lot of mileage out of your title, and poets are also known for doing that as well, using their title as a way to provide context to the words that follow. Or as you see in a lot of, if you're into YA, young adult literature, you look at a Kwame Alexander, and his stories are very much page set as poems. The title is actually the first line. He's using that as a launch pad into the work. So that's just, it's an option. It gives you another thing to do. And then of course, to write long, then go short. He talks about, as we say, economizing and trying to whittle down, which is, the traditional kind of approach to writing that we're taught. But he also was thinking like, you got to go short from the beginning as well. Like, you got to know where you want to go. And a lot of times I know in my non-artistic writing, emails when I'm working for the city or other things that I have to write as a result of my job at the city of Albuquerque, I often find that usually the first page is where I'm just like, priming the pump. And then I'm actually starting to get to the good stuff on page 2. And in some flash fiction is 1 or 2 pages as well. So I feel like that's what he's saying. He's saying get the bad stuff out of your system and then go real short. So that's just say it's a little bit of David Gaffney, a little bit of theory for us as we jump back into these stories. So here's a second one. Manscaping. A man who does his own shrubs probably cuts his own hair. You know him when you see him. At work, at Albertsons, he's the guy that occasionally misses a spot. The guy who has the same haircut since high school, same job, same shrubs. What you didn't know is that he cuts his dad's hair twice a week at a nursing home. Matching haircuts, just like his father had given him all those years. He never began missing spots until he started losing sleep. When he moved his mother back in with him in order to minimize the landscaping of 2 properties. She can't live alone and refuses to be in the same nursing home as her ex-husband. The shrubs are how she likes them. He'd actually like them a little more tame, a little less never-ending story. But for now, between video games, when he goes outside to sneak a cigarette at 2 a.m., he fancies them a pair of gargoyles or griffiths, keepers of the gate. He's even named them routine and responsibility. So, looking for that double entendre at the end, looking for something that resonates, and also having a quick 80s reference to one of my favorite movies, The Never-Ending Story, and those Griffiths and gargoyles that Bastian had to be really confident to get past them without the laser beams that were going to kill him. So that's kind of how I felt jumping into flash fiction as well, going out on a limb and feigning confidence so you can find a real space of confidence to land on. And this book has been pretty well received, so it helped me to take more risks as a writer moving forward. Here's another one, and I will add this, Justin's approach to photography. He works in Nob Hill, actually, and this neighborhood is just east of Carlisle, but west of San Mateo, between Lomas and Central. And his own fascination with this post-World War II era housing was, that these were planned subdivisions, and in the style of, our kind of Pueblo Deco, Pueblo Revival, right? The Mexican architectural style. Um, and the modernity of it at the time meeting the mundane of it today. And so that was in him finding beauty in that. In this piece, you can see in the shadows, lots of beauty in the shadows, which stuck out in some of the stories that I wrote as well. So just giving you, for you folks who have that photographer's bug, a little bit of his approach. The closest thing this king had to a castle was the portcullis of his garage door. Before the vertical of the flat screen and the horizontal of the pool table, before the man cave, back when it was a mausoleum of relative estate sales, framed prom pictures and wedding dresses, back when it was abandoned weight benches and boxes of outgrown action figures and bikes, after the car moved out, before the nest emptied itself in the middle of the floor, back when garages were erected as an obelisk to the greatness of suburbia, when cars became family enough to sleep inside, before the kids came inside and their childhoods given a proper resting place. And I can see I'm sharing you guys, like, this is how we published it with punctuation errors. That was my fault. I should have got someone else to proofread it. That's a good tip for all you writers out there. But you know, when in my poetry, I actually don't use a lot of punctuation. So for me, it was trying to learn another language by putting punctuation in there. And you can see some of the sentence fragments. That's when it really lends itself to poetry. But I think what's more interesting about this piece is this is when I began playing with who's the character. I try to play with this identification that humans generally have with other humans in the story. Definitely this identification that humans have with other humans in pictures. There's lots of studies that say when you look at a picture with a human in it, you are drawn to the eyes and the facial features of the humans in the picture. And so I am trying to insert humans into these stories in many ways, but I'm also trying to do the okey doke, if you will, and say, like, but is this story about the person, or is the story about the building, right? And or is the story about the practice, right? Our practice of becoming suburban, right? You know, and so that to me is that kind of guessing game about, like, what's the story about, but yet making it linear enough to be about something, so people aren't like, what the hell is the story about? But interesting enough for them to come back and read it again, maybe from different perspectives. And I don't know if I accomplished that here. Again, this is all 2020 hindsight, looking back at these things. But I felt like before I knew what I was trying to do, that's what I was trying to do, and it makes the book more interesting now. You know. Here's another one that I'll just share before, instead of kind of trying to give away the tricks afterwards. It was I'm interested as a poet in what storytellers do and what writers do with detail and description. And so when I read long form work as a poet, knowing that I'm a word guy and I'm both as a hip hop person and as a poet, I'm like, what's the punchline? What's the got you line? What's the memorable quotable thing? And that's always kind of been how I looked at, you know, words, whether they're in a song or whether they're in a play. Like we're addicted to Hamilton in my house, right? You know, I'm looking for what's that unforgettable phrase, that punchline, right? I feel like my more narrative oriented friends, my prose friends, are like, but what's the detail? And so I get stuck between a dialogue. Like I'm definitely a lot of my writing space comes from conversations. That's where I get most of my inspiration from, is conversations I'm part of, conversations I'm not part of, especially in the airport. Love to listen to other people's conversations, pay attention to how people talk, do bad impersonations of people's accents. Like I'm very much into language, right? And that dialogue piece. Not always so much into the monologue piece, and definitely like light, sometimes woefully light on descriptions and direction, stage direction and description. And that has a huge place in long form writing and fiction. We have to know what's happening. We have to know the chronology. We have to know the relationships, and a lot of what makes the books, that makes the world that we immerse ourselves in fiction so rich, is the level of detail and description, especially in science fiction. Like I got to know all about every single button on the dashboard that's flying the spaceship, right? And what people are wearing, because I don't have the benefit of pictures to do that work for me. So I feel like sometimes there's this push and pull between description and dialogue, and the greats do both well. I have to definitely get better at description, but I feel safe in dialogue. So in this piece, you can see I went to what I knew and tried to live where I feel most comfortable. It has a fun reference to Breaking Bad too. At the time, I must have been immersed in my Netflix binge rabbit hole of it. But yeah, shout out to Albuquerque. Remember when Albuquerque had drive-through liquor stores? Ray didn't know if he believed him or the premise of his question. Weldon always told the most incredible stories between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m., the time when his parents got home from work, especially when they smoked his mom's medical and played video games. See that overhang? That one right there between the garage and the house? Yeah, my grandpa used to bootleg booze right out of this house. It was legit. Weldon paused. I mean, it was illegal, but it was the perfect setup. Ask my mom when she get home, yo. Ray wasn't interested in fact. He was interested in fiction. An architect to be, he was more impressed with the safety prospect of the detached garage and how Winston's setup was better suited for a fantasy about a meth lab and a high school science teacher, because even if the garage exploded, you still have somewhere to go. And the cool things Justin did with the shadow there. I'm gonna run through a few of these. This one is in the book itself. You can see this is a different page set. Instead of the photo above and the story below, we have these black pages that kind of give some guideposts and anchors to the book. It also switches it up so your eyes don't get tired and doesn't seem too monotonous. But in this one, we kind of tap into, an old legend, the legend of La Llorona. And I'm gonna move it down a little bit so you guys can see all my business and how messy my desktop is, because I couldn't read the top line there, and which means you couldn't read it either. But this is the longest story. This is the longest story in the book. There's no La Llorona for the aquifer, only the river. They warned Johnny Jr. about the arroyo, but not the underworld. So when the city or base dug up his street in search of oil, he considered it an opportunity to see if China, Australia, or Alice in Wonderland really did exist. And no one has seen him since. It was sad, but it served the purpose. See, Johnny Jr. was a very good, albeit curious 9-year-old boy, well-liked by his parents and all the other parents in the neighborhood. Perfect grades, even better manners. Obedient, sometimes misinterpreted as fear by the cooler kids he was desperate to be liked by. The makers of mischief is the antidote to boredom, who grew tired of parents always asking them why they can't be more like Johnny Jr. And the day Johnny Jr. slipped down the rabbit hole, he made history. He finally achieved what he wanted, to be the kid parents warned their kids about. 5 years later, the city or the base has not made so much as a shovel's worth of effort to fill Johnny's hole. The community vigorously protested against it, on the off chance Junior eventually finds his way back home. And that came from a very personal space, because I lived in the International District and they used to dig up my street all the time looking for that oil spill. So yeah, you pulling things from your lived life that annoy you, like orange cones in your street every day, or contaminants in your water. This one is one of the, that's not one of the shorter ones. I'm jumping around here, you guys, bear with me, because I want to make sure that I hit the kind of different things I was trying to do. This one, the one that was definitely more poetry than anything, less dialogue. Which maybe I didn't include, so sorry if I didn't do that. I might have left that one out. But just really fragmented sentences, really lots of repetition, really not giving people a clear sense of what I'm necessarily talking about. That's one that kind of only works if there's an image that's affiliated with it. And I wanted to show you guys the things that I was experiments that kind of went wrong. I would say if they were living outside of the format of this book, but definitely still trying to say, like, what can you do with 200 words? What can you do with 150 words? And really trying to play and kind of break things. Like, you're trying to break the code and break the game. You're trying to do that as much as possible so you can get to a space of a little bit more pure creation where you might surprise yourself, right, with what you find. And so it's interesting looking back at these and putting them side by side and trying to figure out where I was going and how I was playing with language 10 years ago, right, looking back. So this was the shortest one, and I figured I wanted to share that one as well. For those of us that live in Albuquerque, a very common image, at least with the ways that we do that little U parking lot thing, especially in smaller subdivisions in the university area. And yeah, the cars were an interesting piece of this book as well. Like, what is our relationship to houses and what's our relationship to cars? And you'll see that in the last poem that I read you as well. A poem, short story, flash fiction that I read you as well. Some of this story is also the namesake of the book. I think maybe at the time it was the one that most directly spoke to the title of the book, but also to our relationship with sprawl and movement from the city. And I guess that's me being transparent in the work. I hate to be I moved to Albuquerque 16 years ago, and I think there's definitely, because I know, because I've met them, a kind of smugness that comes with East Coasters who move to the Southwest. A little less so than the folks that come from like LA. That's like, we know everything because we're from big cities, especially big cities in the North. And, that's got some historical precedent. But that, like, coming from the big city all of a sudden makes you, smarter than rural spaces and suburbia. But I will say that, just coming from a city the size of Philadelphia to Albuquerque, and having lived in all parts of Albuquerque except the North Valley, and certainly having lived downtown twice, that downtown and the downtown that I experienced in Philly are very different. And that this picture you're looking at now is in a proximity to downtown that if this were Philadelphia, you'd still be in high rises, right? And so I just feel like that's to me, a beautiful thing about Albuquerque is that you can get this best of both worlds, if you will. All the conveniences of a city, but still having a little bit of space, some shrubs, some off-street parking that you don't have to pay for, things like that, which makes it very unique and very cozy a city. So, but it is still like, because of that, and we're a more horizontal than vertical city compared to a lot of the coastal cities, and Chicago and those big cities that go up instead of out. But that, the idea that you can, that you don't have to run from the center of the city. You don't have to run far anyway to get a piece. Here we go. One man's trash is another man's treasure until one man doesn't have a square. One man's trash is another man's treasure until one man doesn't have a spare, only a flat. Often confused with upward mobility, urban flight requires wheels, not wings, and in our wake, a wave of evicted flats. But the park benches downtown are full of tenants, so we create space, more square footage for things we don't need until we need them, like neighbors. And the last one I'm gonna share today is the last poem in the book, and it is this relationship between homes and cars and consumption. Lots of themes in this book. A lot of it, the overarching theme is like, what makes us feel like home? Is it the relationships with the people, or is it the relationships with the stuff? This one tries to have something that's more introspective. Like, the story is definitely internal and contained to the characters here, as opposed to this. Some of those, as you saw me read them, some of them were more 10,000 foot, making public commentary on the situation in the world, right? And so that interplay and that diversity within the book as well, trying to disorient you, so that you don't know what to expect from story to story, right? So it's coming at you from a lot of different angles. Some vehicles are no accident, so he keeps it close by, right outside his bedroom window in case he needs it. Home of the first kiss, front seat as French as could be. 4 months later, a different first. In the back seat, same girl. 2 years before their shotgun sunrise, long before they were really roughing it, long after their parents stopped pretending they were camping, around the time their firstborn was almost delivered in the camper. Just married, still barely soaping the windows. He drove his daughter to prom in it. Her and her date later gave him his first granddaughter. The battery died the day after his wife, same spot for the past 5 years. He'd never driven it without her. But from time to time, only under a full moon, he would go sit in her passenger seat, lay on her side of the wagon bed, and silently pray that he will one day regain his charm. And so there's a little bit about Justin and I, and when we were all up in our feelings creating this thing, as our writers are wont to do, with no real strategy for how it would be consumed, or how many copies it would sell, or whether anybody would care, but really feeling like, for me, feeling like I wanted to do the photographs justice, and for him, feeling like he wanted to do that neighborhood justice, right? And so that was a different kind of energy motivating us to, quote unquote, get it right. We spoke to no neighbors. In fact, after the book was done and released, I did a video where I rode my bike through the neighborhood with a GoPro camera, being in the neighborhood, just trying to get the sounds right, and like rolling up on these houses and being like, I created a whole story for you. And then actually seeing a human being in the front yard and being like, wow, that's pretty weird, almost creepy, but because I made a whole life for you and I have no idea who you are. And now I'm in front of your house with the shrub, gargoyle shrubs. And I'm just like, wow, that's very different than what I wrote. But also going back to our real modus operandi for this was like, how do we create art that is a practice of compassion? Art that literally is putting ourselves in other people's shoes. It's a little bit of people watching. It's a little bit of what happens when you look out the window and, you know, you see the full, the story I didn't include is where the neighbor's looking out the window and he sees all the cars at the house next door. And he's like, what are those kids doing? You know, having a party. Are there drug deals happening there? Whatever. Like we do it, and usually we might do it out of a space of a space that's not as positive, but it's like, but how do you actually use it as a way to kind of really feel and be in other people's lives, a practice of perspective. And so that was really our initial idea. And then this many years later, where streets are desolate and you don't see people, shout out to Mary December. I saw her in the call earlier. You can see one of her reviews there below. And then a year ago in February, a review from the Alibi of the book and the exhibit, and them noticing the kind of thing that you probably got by now that I said earlier, that there's no human beings in these photos. The language is doing the work of putting lives and stories and humans in these photos, which to me is what makes the photos charming, because, you know, we're not navel gazing as humans are wont to do and only identifying with the other human beings in the frame. You know, with disregard for the other living things like the planet that are also in the frame, that is talking to us in this pandemic moment, right? And so it's just interesting. It's interesting that then it became where the real world was, yeah, the streets are vacant and empty and everything is kind of haunting when you drive around. And in the absence of real community, what do? You create community in your brain. And you publish it, and maybe you write 50,000 words like our friend did in the month of July. But that's how you keep your compassion alive, right? That's how you keep your ability to have positive, meaningful human relationships outside of your ego and outside of yourself, and give voice and life to them. And so we didn't know that we were doing that. We did not know, we had no inside track that there was going to be a pandemic 10 years ago, but the book makes a lot of sense now. So that's what I got. That was a great quote that I stole from Mary's review of the book. That is basically what I said, but more condensed and more concise and cooler. We were definitely writing in a space between us, me and Justin as friends, where we were looking for connection and how our art communicated with each other, with each other's. The arts are others, but then definitely seeking that in the world that, you know, at the time was increasingly coming less about neighbors talking over fences and more behind screens. And are we ever behind screens these days? And so I wanted to just show you this one quick thing before I open it up for a few questions, because I kind of got to run away. And Elizabeth said she's happy to take questions that I can't answer, that I can answer through to you electronically. But this was, I wanted to share a person, Tyrese Coleman, and in preparing for this workshop, I did kind of look around and kind of said, you know, what's the tradition of like Black flash fiction, you know? David, I appreciated what David had to add, very academic, and I don't necessarily come from an academic background. So I was like, what are all these hunches that I had about writing this thing? And I'm sure, you know, I'm not that bright. I'm not that intrepid. I'm not, you know, writing a new way here. I'm sure someone's done this before, and who's done it? What Black authors have done this in a way that's a benchmark and something that I can aspire to. And wouldn't you know, Jean Toomer's Kane, Glendon Books, Maud Martha, Claudia Rankin, who literally is one of my favorite living writers. And I got to meet her at the Lensic a few years back. In her book, Citizen, an American Lyric. If you haven't read it, read it. That is really the tradition that, you know, I'm not pulling out of thin air. I'm pulling from things I heard and read and was experienced growing up. These other writers, Jamaica Kincaid, these other writers kind of did the same thing, maybe with a little more academic training than me. But she talks about like, the lyrical mashup of poetry and prose that obviously Gwendolyn Brooks is a poet first, Claudia Rankine as well, Jamaica Kincaid, like creating this space as lyrical, rhythmic writers in storytelling, and kind of approaching flash fiction as a way to, it's like a middle step to those longer forms of writing that they've become successful in. I've not yet gotten the confidence to endeavor to do, even though I'm working on a memoir about my dad's passing, which is longer form, definitely memoir and journal writing. But yeah, like they said, I'm gonna create this middle step. And for Jean Toomer, it's one of the seminal works of the Harlem Renaissance. So it's not, and Claudia Rankine, won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry for Citizen, an American Lyric. So it's not just a middle step. It's like it's a way to go. It's a new approach to interpreting the world for a poet. So that's where I'm at, and that's what I got.